Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about one of the most famous and important passages in all of Western philosophy, and certainly in ancient philosophy, and that's the allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave is so famous and important that it might be fair to classify it as one of the most important in all of world literature. This passage appears at the start of the seventh book of Plato's Republic. And before we can jump into what the passage is about and what it means, we should say something about the context. It's a hard passage to remove surgically from the text, even though it is very commonly read in isolation. Many colleges in their first year seminars and in general education classes tend to isolate the allegory of the cave and assign it as its own text. And there's a very good reason for that, and we'll talk about much later in the episode. But it's not obvious that that's the right way to read the passage, even though that can be fruitful and useful for the purposes of those instructors. But the first thing we need to know about the context is that Plato was having his teacher Socrates recount a story, and a story that's meant to serve an allegorical purpose, about prisoners emerging from a cave and then having to go back into the cave, because that's what suits the purpose that Plato is trying to achieve at that moment in the Republic. So the Republic features the public is about a conversation, a fictional conversation that Socrates' teacher had with a bunch of other characters, all of whom are historical people or were historical people. Plato's teacher Socrates had died in 399 BC, and that's an important fact we'll come back to later because the death of his teacher, his execution at the hands of the Athenians, who didn't like what he was doing and saying for one reason or another, that probably weighs or should weigh on us as we're interpreting the text. But Socrates has just summed up his view that the ideal city is one governed by philosophers. There's a lot to that doctrine that we can't talk about here because it's just too big a doctrine. But the basic idea is that if we're going to reliably have just institutions and reliably maintain those just institutions, we need to have a ruler who understands what justice is, who needs to know justice, among other things like wisdom and courage and so on. We might be able to get by with someone who's ignorant of justice for some short amount of time, someone who just gets it lucky, as it were, in the creation of institutions, just institutions. But that's not good enough. We want someone who can reliably create just institutions and maintain them when they're there. And for that reason, we need someone with knowledge, and that's going to be the philosopher's job. So again, this person is going to be an expert in knowing things like justice and goodness and wisdom and so on. On In order to facilitate that, we're going to need a very complicated, regimented, institutionalized education system in order to educate young and up and coming rulers, in order to make sure that they, at the pinnacle of their education, can go back, at the pinnacle of their education, can learn what justice and goodness are. For various complicated reasons, Plato thinks that a very, very, very good majority of that education has to be mathematical. And so we should imagine a very heavily regimented mathematical education system that's supposed to culminate in the learning of the nature of justice and goodness and so on. And with that in mind, Socrates, who is Plato's main character in this dialogue, as I've said, divides all of reality into four kinds of things. He imagine a straight line, divided into four segments. which for which reason we usually call this image the divided line. So this is Plato's own image, and it's a very famous and important one in the context of the Republic. And uh, and we'll come back to these divisions later in the episode because they're going to feature in our interpretation of the allegory of the cave. But basically, Plato says that we're the first segment of the line are images of things. The second segment on the line are the things of which those things are images. So the first segment today would be represented by, like, let's say a photograph of a teacup, right? The teacup in the photograph is a mere image of a real teacup, or a quote unquote real teacup. And then the second segment would feature that physical teacup itself. The third segment is a little harder to interpret, but it's conventionally interpreted as containing mathematical objects. These would be things like, like a rectangle or a square or something, but not the rectangle or square that we see and, stumble into and perceive physically in the world around us, but the kind of objects that are hypothesized by people in mathematical proofs. So when someone says, "Oh, here's the formula for calculating the area of a circle, or the circumference of a circle, or the area of a rectangle," they don't have in mind any particular circle or rectangle. What they have in mind is some kind of ideal abstract rectangle or circle. The crucial thing for Plato was that these are objects that are hypothesized. So, like, the easiest way to imagine this would be, let's say you're reading a mathematical proof, and the proof begins by saying, "Let there be lines A, B, C, and D." Okay, or let there be lines A, B, and C and D. These lines are being hypothesized. Mathematicians aren't proving the existence of such a line, they're merely hypothesizing them and then making proofs about them and talking about them. So these are hypothetical objects that don't actually exist in the real world, or in the physical world is what I mean by the real world. If you're still not getting it, the easiest way to imagine it, if you're really still not getting it, is something like this. Let's say that I say to you that there are people in your house right now. That statement is true only if there are people in your house right now. If there are no people in your house right now, the statement is false, right? So a statement like that is true only if it corresponds to reality, and if it doesn't correspond to reality, then it's false. But then what about a statement like 2 plus 3 equals 5? 2 plus 3 equals 5 is true, but you might be scratching your head like, what makes that statement true? What is 2? What is 3? What is 5? Well, the thing is that when you do mathematics, you just learn about these things. You're not actually proving the existence of 2, right? It's actually a weird thing for many of us to even think about proving the existence of 2. What are you talking about? But the point is that these are hypothesized. We're just going to say that they exist. We're going to suppose they exist for the sake of making some mathematical statement and talking about it. But the fourth segment is when we understand these things without the use of a hypothesis. Though this would be someone who truly understands the existence of these non-corporeal or incorporeal things. These are things that don't exist in the physical world, but you understand them. So, for example, the nature of justice, the nature of the nature of goodness. We might include mathematical objects in this too, but they would have to be things we're not hypothesizing. So if you were going to grasp these mathematical things and put them in segment 4 of the divided line, they would have to be things that you understand why they exist, not just merely hypothesizing them in order to talk about something or make a proof. But as you can imagine from what I said a few minutes ago about the education system, the point is that when you understand these things in the fourth segment of the divided line, you've completed your education. You now understand what justice is, and you don't just need to hypothesize that something like that exists. You actually understand these definitions and natures of things. So, with that in mind, Plato moves rather briskly to the allegory of the cave. And then, when I'm done the allegory of the cave, to we'll come back to how the categories of the divided line map on to the things in the allegory of the cave. So, I want you to imagine people in a cave. They're chained in place. They've been there their whole lives. There's a fire that's behind them and they're staring at a wall. Okay. There are statues being moved around behind them too, so that the shadows are being cast on a wall. The prisoners watch the shadows that are cast by the statues, and their bodies are chained such that they have to watch the things that are on the wall. They can close their eyes, of course, but whenever they open their eyes, they can't really turn around. And so all they're watching are the shadows cast by the statues. These people are so accustomed to seeing the shadows on the wall that those things are the only things the prisoners know. The prisoners have their conceptions of reality and truth limited to what they can see, which in this case means the shadows on the walls. Now, I want you to imagine someone else who comes along to free them from their chains. The freed prisoner feels pain and discomfort and confusion and dizziness as he or she stretches his or her limbs for the first time. And then the person who's come down frees other people, and they all go through this difficult process of stretching their limbs for the first time. Their whole sense of themselves and their whole world are being challenged here. And as they move around and look behind them for the first time, they see that what they thought was real was actually just shadows cast by the statues. The prisoner, upon reflection, might say to themselves something like, now I see things more clearly. Now I see things correctly. Now I see things as they really are. Or the things that I thought were real before weren't actually real. This doubting and questioning of what was real was why a few minutes ago when I was talking about the allegory of the cave, I kept wanting to walk back or retract my use of the adjective real or real world to describe things in the physical world, because the whole nature of reality here is supposed to be what we're questioning. Because as the prisoner is guided to the exit of the cave and comes into the light, and the other prisoners are guided too, they're all having this experience of questioning what they thought was real previously. Now the process becomes even more painful, right? Literally painful, as the eyes struggle to adjust to the splendor of the outside world and to the sunlight. It's so difficult for the prisoners to see these things that they can't even look upon them in their own right, but they have to look upon images of these things, reflections of the sun in a pool of water, for instance. Or it might be easier for them to look at the sky at nighttime, that freedom from the daylight, the burning daylight that their eyes had never been experienced before, that freedom from this thing helps them see. Not very clearly maybe, but more clearly than their poor little eyes could take it. But after enough careful practice and patience, the former prisoner might look upon the sun in its own right and behold it. These prisoners might come to the realization that the outside world and the light that allows them to see it depends on the sun. Everything that they used to think was real, in fact, depended on the sun for its existence. But now these escaped prisoners reflect on the sorry state of people who are still imprisoned in the cave. The cave is quite deep and there are different rooms. And the guide who came down to free them, their liberator, only freed one room, one small room. Some of these escaped prisoners might take it upon themselves to see and view it as their responsibility to go back and free more people from the cave. I say that this might be a sad realization, not just because it's sort of heart wrenching to imagine people in the cave, but it's actually sad for the people who have to go back in there because one, they just spent a lot of time getting out, and two, those people in the cave won't like having their reality questioned. Not everyone who's freed is grateful for their liberation. And learning that you were wrong, being told that you were wrong, might lead some of these prisoners to treat the person who liberated them very painfully and unpleasantly. So that's the allegory of the cave. Now, what does it mean? Well, in reality, there's a lot to be said for it, perhaps so much that it's sort of hopeless to try to capture all of it. I'm going to say some things that I think command some amount of scholarly agreement. The points I'm going to make are all different from each other, but they're not really in competition. But I do want to just acknowledge that there are many, many ways to interpret this. And that's why it's so useful in a lot of general education college classes, high school classes, first year seminars in college. There's another reason for that too that I'll get to in a moment. But this text can mean a lot of things to different people. Like there might even be personal interpretations of this. Someone who was in a religion or a cult, for example, and was eventually freed and left behind the cult, might honestly see themselves in the prisoner, right? Who's escaped, who might say that, well, this actually reflects my own, quote unquote, liberation story from this cult or imprisonment. It's hard to believe Plato has something like that explicitly on his mind when he's writing this. Of course, it might have been on his mind and he just didn't indicate that explicitly in the text. But certainly, we should be free to use this wonderful, amazing text in a variety of ways. And so, nothing I say in this episode should be construed as giving us the only interpretation to the exclusion of all others. Part of what makes this text so powerful is just that it can be read in a number of ways. So, let's get into what this passage means explicitly in the context of the Republic. So we should put this down perhaps as the first point, which is that the different stages that the prisoner goes through refer to or correspond to different segments on the divided line. So remember, the first segment was images. These were images of physical things. So I gave the example earlier of a photograph of a teacup. That's like seeing the shadows on the wall. The sensible objects was segment number two, and that's like the statues that are casting those shadows that are on the wall. The At this point in the story, now the prisoner has escaped, right? They've left behind the statues and the shadows, and they begin to look at things in the external world in, like, let's say, reflections in water at nighttime. They need to get some bit of remove from the sun, in order to because their eyes just aren't adjusting. That'd be like the way that people in the third segment of the divided line have to hypothesize the existence of things. So that's why I made such a big deal about using hypotheses as a kind of crutch or something to depend on, because you're just not able to just not able to understand the thing on its own terms. So you have to just say, this is what 2 plus 3 equals. But I don't actually know what 2 and 3 are. So we've made a big leap. We're thinking about things without we've left behind corporeal existence here, and we're thinking about something incorporeal, but we don't really understand the sort of existence we're talking about. And then you get to segment 4, which is when you can look at the world around you in the sunlight comfortably. So that's why Plato, that's one aspect of this is that, and I stress this to my undergraduate students quite a lot, is that the divided line is a helpful way of representing everything that exists, but it's not a perfect way of representing everything that exists, because what we really could use as well is some imagery to help us describe movement along the line, right? Which maps onto cognitive improvement, intellectual improvement. We're getting better as we are going up the line and out of the cave. And so we want something like that. And The allegory of the cave gives us that image, right? Gives us that image. Ultimately, I would say that that's point number one here, but I'm going to move to interpretation or point two. But again, these aren't to the exclusion of each other, and I think point two actually maps onto this or fits with this fairly well, which is that this is supposed to represent Plato's theory of education. This captures what it looks like for Plato to have the proper development of a human being. When things go well for you intellectually or cognitively or mentally, you move in a development that's like this. Is it painful? Absolutely. It's always learning is always unpleasant, and one of the painful aspects of it is learning that you are wrong. And so this is supposed to be like how difficult it is for the prisoner to stretch their legs or use their eyes when they're outside the cave. The sunlight hurts, learning something new hurts. It's very difficult. And there's always the unpleasantness of learning that you thought you knew, but you didn't actually know. So you're questioning your reality. And the fact that Plato makes this be a process with stages is, I think, important. In the allegory of the cave, we don't learn about someone who's stopped and stuck their whole lives in the cave, or stopping at one stage or another. We know that it's possible for that to happen. It does happen, but it would be interesting to hear Plato speak more about such a kind of person. But either way, we know that sometimes people just won't actually make it all the way out of the cave. Or if they do, maybe they never get to the point where they can use their eyes properly and actually see the sun and see things in all the splendor of the world around us, right? So the theory of education is important, and this is part of why it's taught so frequently in general education classes and first year seminars in college. So earlier I said that part of the reason was because it's a text so pregnant with meaning that you can interpret it in any number of ways. And surely that's true and is a part of it as well. But another part of it is that college is a time when a lot of students question some of the beliefs they grew up with. I mean, you're joining young adulthood, you're leaving behind a lot of beliefs, and you have to learn new things about the world. That's a very challenging, difficult time to find yourself in that way. And that's supposed to map on to the theory of Plato's theory of education and this journey out of the cave. To move on to the next point, which is related to the second point, which is that the guide doesn't teach the prisoner in our most familiar sense of teach, right? The most familiar sense of teaching is that someone comes to you and you just sort of dump knowledge into their head. You just tell them things, you lecture at them, you talk at them, not unlike what I'm doing right now. But you don't really understand something unless you learn to see it for yourself. And this is the deepest, most rewarding kind of learning. And this is how the guide, quote unquote, teaches the prisoner, is that the guide gets the prisoners to see something for themselves. The guide helps the prisoner, the guide supports the prisoner, the guide nudges the prisoner. In fact, the guide is guiding, right? But there isn't really a place in Plato's theory of education for straight up telling someone what to think, right? I'll repeat that because it's an important point. There isn't a place in Plato's view of education for straight up telling someone what to think, or for, and certainly there's no place in the allegory of the cave for that. Learning is about coming to see something for yourself. And for that reason, Plato, in this part of the Republic, describes the art of education not as a way of putting light into someone's eyes, but instead of turning their head around. So that image of not putting light in someone's eyes, that's like a slightly more elegant version of the image I gave a few minutes ago when I said that teaching sometimes seems to us to be a matter of just dumping knowledge in someone's head. But learning for Plato was helping someone see, teaching someone for Plato was a matter of helping them see things for themselves. And on that note, another point is that the guide in the cave, the person who freed the prisoner, is supposed to represent Plato's institutionalized education system. So that's why earlier I stressed that this part of the context is that this is what it means to educate someone for Plato. He wants his rulers, who are the people who are being educated here, he wants the rulers to achieve the highest form of cognitive development. You can't do that without some amount of help, right? These are supposed to be the guide who allegorically represents the institutionalized education system, but the guide is supposed to help people in this indirect way of positioning them to have the right sort of experiences. And it's hard not to imagine that Plato sees the prisoner as himself and the guide is the historical Socrates, who mentored him during the most formative years of Plato's life. So earlier I said Socrates was put to death by the Athenians. He was executed. That happened in 399 BC. Plato was born about 29 years earlier or so in 428 BC. So Plato's young adulthood was spent in large part with Socrates and ended in a huge way with Socrates' execution. So we can see that that's probably weighing on Plato here too, even though that's not something that really appears explicitly in the text. When we connect that thought with the way that the various stages of the ascent out of the cave are unpleasant, difficult, challenging, uncomfortable, right? Because it's requiring us to adjust our sense of reality as we change our perception of ourselves and of the world and reality and truth and existence and so on, we can begin to see what's going on with Socrates' execution, right? Because I said that the allegory ends with with someone who's completed their ascent, they've completed their education, they've completed their cognitive development, and they know they have to go back into the cave to free other people, to sort of pay it forward, so to speak. But doing so comes at their own personal peril. They're risking their own lives to do that. And that's an important point because Socrates actually did risk his own life and he died. He died, right? And like if Socrates was asking the Athenians a very difficult question, right? And he was forcing the Athenians to ask a very difficult question, which was, what does it say about ourselves if we spend such a huge part of our lives being mistaken about what was important, about what was real, right? It isn't an exaggeration to say that so much of Plato's thought revolves around the idea that we care about the wrong things. When Socrates is was on the stand as he's testifying at his own trial, Plato depicts Socrates as admonishing the Athenians for caring about the wrong things. Of course, he's unsuccessful in persuading them not to kill him, but we do get a glimpse into the larger worldview here, which is one where, philosophers like Socrates and Plato prompt us to ask very difficult questions about ourselves and about our lives. That's part of what makes this challenging and uncomfortable, right? This psychological or cognitive existential difficulty is this is mirrored in the story by the physical agony of the prisoners as they leave the cave. Also, they go through their own psychological agony as they realize they've been in prison for their whole lives. But it's a very dangerous thing to be the messenger. It's a very dangerous thing to be the messenger when the message you bring is one that's full of challenge and discomfort, right? But the point of calling this the liberation of the prisoner is to stress the way that we become more free as human beings when we know more about the truth. When we know more of the truth in the real world, we're liberated, which is again a very powerful thing to teach in a first year college class or towards the end of someone's high school education when they're old enough to appreciate this. Knowing more about the world frees us in that way. But similarly, just as much as there's an account of cognitive improvement, of getting better, we could also talk about cognitive deterioration. Of course, this is someone who gets stuck in the cave or worse, can't handle the discomfort and goes back into the cave, right? Because just as much as we can talk about using our minds correctly, we can also talk about them using them incorrectly, of making mistakes and caring about the wrong things. That when we pay attention too much to images of what's real, we end up losing our humanity and freedom and the independence that was supposed to come from being a free thinker, right? So it's really no wonder that the allegory of the cave might appeal to someone in a biographical, personal sense about their journey, leaving behind a religion or a cult that they had when they were younger, right? This really, I think, captures the bulk of the most scholarly, serious interpretations of the allegory of the cave. I'm sure there are more that scholars kick around, and certainly this text is taught very differently than just in these ways in college classes all around the world. But I think that this captures a huge part of what the allegory of the cave means in a historical context, specifically the context of the sixth and seventh books of the Republic. But it's worth pointing out again that this passage can be read in any number of ways. I'm sure that when college teachers teach this class and they're not in a philosophy department, they will mention the way that social media, paying too much attention to social media, is like paying attention to the shadows on the wall, the things that look real but aren't. And when we get tricked, we end up becoming, in a way, enslaved by these images. In the same way that the prisoners are imprisoned indefinitely until they overcome some of these things. This passage has also been influential in any number of ways. I mean, the idea, for example, of the darkness of the cave compared to the beauty of the sunlight and the daylight that represents truth. That's a motif that recurs all throughout Western literature and Western media. At any rate, the connected ideas here, such as the philosopher ruler and the structure of reality that the allegory of the cave is mapping onto, these are things that we'll talk about in future episodes. But for now, I think this suffices for our look at the allegory of the cave. Thank you very much.